calls to blood, beast's curse looms where the shadows flood. Son takes the burden, father be freed, or else the force keeps both souls in need.
Longing for roots. David leaned back against the worn leather couch, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as the rain pattered against the window. His girlfriend, Rachel, sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as he absent-mindedly traced circles on her palm. He'd been like this for days, distant, thoughtful, a man caught up in the labyrinth of his mind. Rachel broke the silence, her voice gentle but urgent. "David, you've barely spoken about anything else for weeks. You really want to go, don't you?" David sighed, raking a hand through his hair. I don't know, Rach. I mean, yeah, I do. I've spent so many years wondering who I am, where I came from, and now I've finally got something. Just a name, O'Malley, and a location. It's a tiny spot in Ireland, some place called Gloomgrove. Rachel's brow furrowed. Gloomgrove? Sounds charming. He chuckled, shaking his head. I know, but that's all I have. A name and a location. My entire life I've only known I was adopted. There's never been any connection to my past. No story, no family. This might be my only chance. Rachel considered his words. I get it, but you don't even know what you're walking into. This relative, whoever he is, might not want to be found. What if he's dangerous? David shrugged. Dangerous or not, he's family. He's the only blood I know of. I've thought about this every day since I got that letter. Rachel tightened her grip on his hand. Then I think you have to go. But promise me you'll be careful. I know you're searching for answers, but what if they aren't the ones you want? David's gaze turned resolute. If there's anything to learn about my family, I need to see it for myself, no matter what it is. David clutched his ticket as he boarded the train from the airport, feeling the heavy weight of anticipation mixed with unease. He sank into a worn seat by the window, watching the landscape shift from urban sprawl to rolling hills and dense, misty forests. The rhythmic clacking of the train lulled him into a trance, and his eyes grew heavy. In his dream, he was young again, no more than 4, standing barefoot on the creaky wooden floor of a small, dimly lit house. His mother's face, streaked with tears, loomed above him, her trembling hands clutching his shoulders. She was crying, pleading, her voice thick with desperation. "No, I won't give him up," she cried, her arms wrapping tightly around his small frame. "He's my baby." A towering man, tall and broad, stood before her, his face shadowed, but his voice carried a grim finality. "We must. He can't be part of this. We cannot risk it." David watched his mother collapse, sobbing, as he was gently but firmly pulled from her grasp. Moments later, he saw himself standing in the entryway of a cold, unfamiliar building, the home for abandoned children. His small hand reached out, but his mother was gone. He was alone. The train lurched to a halt, and David jolted awake, his heart pounding. The intercom crackled, announcing his stop. He gathered his bag, still shaken from the vivid dream. The platform was silent, and a chill lingered in the air as he made his way towards the inn. The small building looked weathered, its sign hanging slightly askew. Inside, a small group of locals gathered around the bar, their voices quiet as he approached the counter. An older woman with sharp eyes glanced up from behind the counter, watching him carefully as he approached. "Hello," David said, attempting a polite smile. "I'd like a room for the night, please." She didn't return his smile. "Where are you headed?" David hesitated. "I'm looking for a place called Gloomgrove. I believe it's near here." At the mention of Gloomgrove, the murmur in the room ceased. Faces turned toward him, suspicion etched into every stare. The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here," she said coldly, crossing her arms. "Best turn around and go back to where you came from." David frowned. I'm looking for a relative. The name O'Malley. It's important." At the sound of the name, a few patrons muttered angrily, and one man spat on the floor. The innkeeper's mouth set into a hard line. "O'Malley, you don't want any part of that family," she said. "Whatever reason brought you here, it'll bring you nothing but grief. Please, I just need a room for the night." Her gaze was unyielding. "We're full. Best be on your way." David gritted his teeth, frustration boiling inside him. He picked up his bag, muttering a quick, "Thank you," before he turned and headed out the door. His hired car, waiting in the lot from earlier, offered a brief moment of relief as he climbed inside and started the engine. He glanced at his map, hoping to find another place to stay for the night. As he pulled away from the inn, he cast one last glance at the shadowed faces in the window, their stern eyes following him as he drove into the night. David was 4 again, curled up in a small bunk in a dim, drafty dormitory. Around him, children lay huddled under thin blankets, their quiet breaths the only sound in the room. But David couldn't sleep. He gripped the edge of his blanket, staring out the narrow window, calling out in a tiny whisper, "Mama!" A tear slipped down his cheek, and he wiped it away, struggling to understand what had happened. Why had she left him? Why did she have to go? A shadow passed outside, and he froze, his tiny body rigid with fear. He squinted into the darkness. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. Not quite human, yet not fully beast. Fur clung to its twisted features, and sharp teeth glinted in the faint moonlight. David's heart hammered, but he was too frightened to scream. He blinked, and the face vanished. When he looked again, it was gone. David jolted awake, gasping. In the safety of a modern hotel room, he sat up, the morning light filtering through the curtains, his pulse still racing from the dream. It had been so vivid, so real. The memory lingered, like a bruise on his mind, as he swung his legs out of bed and checked the map on his phone. Today, he would find Gloomgrove. After a quick breakfast, he climbed into his car and set the GPS to guide him. He drove through winding country roads, watching the hills grow steeper, the trees denser as he neared his destination. The sign for the Gloomgrove loomed ahead, old and weathered. He pulled off onto a narrow path that disappeared into the forest, parking where the trail grew too thick for the car to pass. He took a deep breath, his fingers clenching his phone as he stepped into the woods. The forest closed in around him, shadows stretching out in the muted daylight. The trees towered overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. He walked, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath his boots the only sound. Every now and then, he heard rustling in the undergrowth, and glimpses of movement from the corner of his eye. David pulled out his phone, only to find that he had no reception, and the GPS had frozen. He let out a frustrated sigh. "Great," he muttered. "I'm lost." The forest seemed to grow thicker as he wandered deeper, the air colder, heavier. He paused, feeling the prickling sensation of being watched. His eyes darted around, but there was nothing but endless trees and shadows. A low growl broke the silence, followed by the rustling of undergrowth. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the trees. He spun around, trying to pinpoint the direction, his heart thundering as fear clawed at his mind. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. A deep voice, with a thick Irish accent, answered from the shadows. "And what might ye be doing here, stranger?" David turned sharply, his eyes searching for the source. Out from behind a tree stepped a tall, rugged man, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a weather-beaten hat. His eyes were dark, piercing, and there was an unsettling intensity in his stare. David swallowed hard, nerves tingling. I'm David. I'm looking for the O'Malley residence." The man's gaze hardened, and he was silent for what felt like an eternity, his eyes studying David as if weighing his soul. At last he spoke, his voice quiet but laced with a strange fire. "So, you're kin then? An O'Malley by blood?" David nodded, trying to steady his voice. "Yes. Or, I think I am. I've come a long way to find them." The man's eyes lit up, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "Well then, I'm Finian, woodsman for the O'Malley estate," he said, extending a gloved hand. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, lad." David felt a strange comfort settle over him, his fear easing as he shook Finian's hand. "Thank you, Finian," he replied, a cautious smile breaking through his nerves. "It would be much appreciated if you could take me to the O'Malley place." The woodsman's lips curled into a slight grin. "Aye, I'll lead you through the woods. Just stay close. These parts have a way of swallowing up those who wander too far." As they started down the winding forest path, David felt both relief and a lingering unease, not entirely certain what he had just agreed to follow. As they walked deeper into the dark, twisted forest, the thick branches above nearly blotted out the sky, casting long shadows across the path. The silence was broken only by the occasional crackling of undergrowth, and Finian's voice, low and measured. "You know, the O'Malleys haven't had a visitor in nearly 30 years, he said, casting a sidelong glance at David. "Some commotion about a family feud back then. We all thought the family line had died out, or at least all the O'Malley sons anyway." David felt a prickle of unease at the word sons. He turned to Finian, who watched him with an almost curious expression. "Aye, the O'Malley sons are a special sort. You wouldn't happen to be one of them sons now, would you, David?" Finian's eyes gleamed, a strange glint, catching in the shadowed lines of his face. David's stomach twisted, but he nodded cautiously. "I'm not entirely sure. I was adopted as a child, and I've spent years trying to trace my heritage. Everything I've found points to the O'Malleys, but it's all bits and pieces. I was hoping coming here might fill in the blanks." Finian gave a thoughtful nod. "And what of your mother? Do you know much of her?" David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, faded photograph. The image was torn at the edges, smudged with time, but the woman's soft, caring eyes and gentle smile were unmistakable. "This is all I have," he said, handing the photo to Finian. Finian's face softened, his eyes lighting up with recognition as he studied the picture. He stopped mid-step, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "Ah, she was a beauty, a kind soul. So, it was her then, Maeve O'Malley." David's heart skipped a beat. "You knew her?" Finian nodded, his face solemn. "Aye, I knew Maeve well. She loved her family more than anything in this world. When she lost her son," he shook his head, voice laden with sorrow, "she couldn't live with the pain. She just gave up. Stopped eating, stopped talking. She drifted into her own world, and a few months later, she was gone. Poor girl." David's chest ached, the words pulling memories from the dark recesses of his mind. Fragments of dreams and faint, distant images filled his mind. His mother's soft voice, her arms wrapped around him, her whispered words. I don't know exactly what happened to her, he murmured, almost to himself. I've had dreams, strange memories that feel real but blurred, like looking through a fog. I remember her crying, and a man taking me away, and then nothing. Finian gave a small nod, as if he understood. Aye, she was a strong one, your mother, but the heartache was too much. She lost her son that night, or so we thought. He turned, a knowing glint in his eye. Seems she was clever enough to keep you safe, hidden from whatever cursed fate followed the O'Malley sons. David looked at him, the realization settling heavily on his shoulders. So, she did everything she could to protect me. Finian's face softened. Aye, lad. She did. You were all that mattered to her. He handed the photo back, his voice quiet but firm. And now that you've returned, the O'Malley line may yet have a second chance. David's hand closed around the worn edges of the photograph, his mother's face smiling back at him, a small piece of the puzzle he was only beginning to understand. David trudged through the darkened woods beside Finian, the trees seeming to close in around them, branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air was thick and damp, and with each step, the sounds of the forest grew stranger. A low growl echoed in the distance, followed by a chilling howl. David's stomach twisted with nerves, but he pressed on. So, how many of the O'Malleys are left? He asked, glancing at Finian. Finian gave a small, almost eerie smile. They're almost all gone, lad. But you'll meet the ones that remain soon enough. They'll be pleased to see you, I'm sure. David felt a chill run down his spine, but tried to keep his voice steady. What about this curse? I've heard rumors, but I don't know what's true. At the mention of the curse, Finian's smile faded, his face taking on a somber expression. He stopped in his tracks, looking into the darkness, as if reliving a memory. The curse, he murmured, his voice low and tense. It's what brought our family down, the curse of the beast. For over 80 years, I've watched it tear the O'Malleys apart one by one. It changes us, lad, makes us into things we don't recognize. He turned to David, a strange fiery gleam in his eye. But now that you're here, maybe, just maybe, we'll see this curse through to the end. David's brow furrowed, the weight of Finian's words settling heavily on him. Our family, he asked, a note of confusion in his voice. Are you an O'Malley too? Finian's eyes flickered, and a shadow passed over his face. Without answering, he turned and pointed ahead, his voice distant. We're here. David looked up, his eyes landing on a worn, crumbling structure, just visible through the trees. The O'Malley house. It was old, its walls darkened with moss, shutters hanging at odd angles, and the roof sagging in places. The house stood like a ghost, forgotten and almost swallowed by the forest around it. He stared at the building, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it, though it looked half abandoned. This is it, he whispered, disappointment mingling with unease. Aye, Finian said, his voice a mere murmur. It may not look like much now, but it's been home to the O'Malleys for centuries. Every stone has a story, and every shadow a secret. David stepped forward, his heart racing, and the forest grew eerily silent around them, as if holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside the dilapidated house, shadows clung to every corner, the air thick with the scent of age and decay. Dust swirled in the faint light, filtering through cracks in the walls. David took a step, his voice echoing softly in the emptiness. Where are the other O'Malleys? He asked, glancing around the vacant rooms. Finian closed the door behind them, his lips curling into a small, bittersweet smile. They're here, lad. I'm all that's left, he said quietly. I had to be sure. You were who you claimed to be. I'm your mother's brother, your uncle. I'm Finian O'Malley." David's breath caught as the realization settled in, and before he could speak, he saw the glimmer of thought in Finian's eyes. "You don't know what this means to me, lad," Finian whispered, his voice breaking. "To have you here, flesh and blood. I thought I was the last. I thought I'd be cursed in these woods until the end of time. But now you're here. I can be free." David's brow furrowed in confusion. How can I help?" Finian's face crumpled, and he sank into a worn armchair, wiping his eyes. "You have no idea, lad, how torturous it's been. Stuck here alone year after year, no family, no kin, just me in the woods, nothing but shadows and memories. But now," he looked up, a desperate glint in his eyes, "maybe there's a chance for me. Maybe you can help free me from the curse that binds me." David nodded slowly, unsure of what he was agreeing to, but feeling the weight of Finian's words. "I'll do what I can, Finian. I'll help if there's a way." Finian's demeanor shifted, a sudden eagerness flashing across his face. For a moment, he looked like a man finally glimpsing hope after years of despair, but as he straightened, his eyes darted away, a flicker of something hidden in his gaze. David could sense it, a shadow, a secret that Finian wasn't telling him. As Finian's face softened into a smile, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking beneath his uncle's grateful words, something dark and desperate. Dinner was a sombre affair. Finian had prepared a simple stew, its warmth a welcome contrast to the cold, eerie house. They ate in silence, with Finian occasionally casting glances at David, his gaze flickering with an intensity David couldn't quite place. They spoke of his journey, the years Finian had spent in solitude, and the legacy of the O'Malleys. Yet there was an unspoken tension beneath each word, as if Finian was holding something back. As the evening waned, Finian showed David to a small room tucked away in the back of the house. David lay in bed, exhaustion mingling with unease, and despite himself, he drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, David found himself back in the cold dormitory of his childhood, the dim light barely illuminating the rows of bunk beds around him. He was a child again, small and afraid, gripping his blanket as he stared out the window. The fog rolled over the landscape, thick and ghostly, and a figure emerged from the mist, a face pressed against the glass, half man, half beast. David froze, heart pounding, as the face grew clearer, more distinct. It was Finian. The eyes, though twisted with something feral, were unmistakably his uncle's. David's pulse quickened, fear crawling up his spine, and just as he tried to scream, he jolted awake, gasping for air. He sat up in the dark, his chest heaving. As his senses adjusted, he became aware of another sound, faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone sobbing, muffled and sorrowful, echoing through the stillness of the old house. Heart racing, David crept out of bed and into the hall. The house was silent, shadows stretching across the walls. He followed the sound, his footsteps soft as he made his way down a narrow corridor. The sobbing grew louder, each soft cry laced with despair. He paused outside a room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Swallowing hard, he nudged it open. Inside, in the dim light cast by a single candle, he found Finian, slumped in an armchair, his face buried in his hands as he wept. "I cannot do it again." Finian's voice was a broken whisper, more to himself than to anyone else. "I cannot become that thing. It tears at my soul. The moon, it'll be full tomorrow. I cannot." David took a shaky step forward. "Finian." Finian looked up, his tear-streaked face turning to David. His eyes seemed unnaturally red in the candlelight, glistening with both sadness and something more, a dark, haunted intensity. "Ah, David, lad," he murmured, wiping his face and forcing a strained smile. "Don't mind me. I've been alone here for so long, I'm overwhelmed that we've found each other at last." David forced himself to return the smile, but a chill gnawed at him, lingering from his dream. He could sense that his uncle's sorrow ran deeper than he knew, a weight carried alone for too long. And though Finian spoke of relief, David couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister lurked within his uncle's haunted gaze. David hadn't slept a wink after the night's events. He watched the pale morning light seep through the dusty windows, his mind tangled with questions. But Finian was nowhere to be found. The old house was silent and unsettling in the daylight. David wandered its rooms, finding only remnants of the past, faded portraits on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him, and claw-like scratch marks along the edges of doors and window frames, as if something wild had been trapped inside. He waited all day, but Finian didn't return. As evening fell, shadows lengthened, and the sky began to darken. Just as the last slivers of sunlight disappeared behind the tree line, David saw movement outside. Finian emerged from the woods, carrying a bundle of firewood and a freshly killed rabbit slung over his shoulder. He gave David a grin, his teeth catching the fading light as he approached. "You'll need to get used to this if you're to take over here, lad," Finian said, dropping the wood near the fire. David blinked in confusion. "Well, Finian, I was actually thinking about getting back. I've been away long enough. We can definitely stay in touch. Maybe you could come to the city with me." Finian's face darkened slightly, but he forced a nod. "Maybe." He cleared his throat. "But first, there's something important we need to discuss. Let me fix us dinner, and we'll talk." David's curiosity mounted as Finian prepared their meal, the savoury scent of cooked rabbit filling the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that Finian was holding back something crucial, some deeper truth about the family, perhaps even about his mother. As they finally sat down, David couldn't contain himself any longer. "So," David said, his voice hesitant, "what was it you wanted to discuss?" Finian held up a hand. "Eat first, lad. Best we both have our strength for this conversation." The meal was eaten in silence, a palpable tension in the air. Finally, when they had finished, Finian set down his utensils, his face shadowed with the weight of years. "You see, lad," he began, his voice steady but laden with sorrow, "the men of the O'Malley family have lived here for generations, bound by a curse none of us could escape." He paused, his gaze drifting to the walls, as if he could see into the past. "When your mother was born, she was the first daughter in a line that had always been sons. She wanted nothing to do with this place, this legacy. She met your father, a kind-hearted man, and tried to start a life far away. They had you, and she hid you from us, from me." David felt his stomach knot. "Why? What exactly is this curse?" Finian sighed, his eyes dark and haunted. "A curse, lad, is one of the beast, passed down through the bloodline from father to son. My father cursed me, as his father cursed him. I was meant to pass it to my own son, but I had none. So when your mother left with you, she stole my chance at freedom. You see, the curse binds us until we pass it on. And I've been alone, bound to this godforsaken place, for decades." David's face drained of colour as he listened, horror dawning on him. Finian's voice turned cold. "I tried to find you once, but your father stopped me, a fool. But now you're here." His eyes glinted with a chilling fervour. "It's time, David. Time for me to be free." David gripped the edge of the table, his heart racing. has to be a way out. A doctor. A cure. Finian laughed bitterly, his voice thick with scorn. Oh, you're a naive one, David. Stupid city folk, always thinking there's a cure for every curse. Suddenly, he fell silent, his gaze shifting to the window where the full moon had begun to rise, casting a pale glow over the room. His voice dropped to a low murmur, almost a chant, as he recited,
Under the O'Malley moon, blood calls to blood, a beast's curse looms where the shadows flood. Son takes the burden, father be freed, or else the forest keeps both souls in need.
As the rhyme left his lips, Finian's face contorted, his eyes gleaming with a savage hunger. David pushed his chair back, his body frozen with fear, watching as his uncle's shadow stretched and shifted grotesquely in the moonlight. Finian's body began to twist and contort, his limbs lengthening as his spine arched grotesquely, bone cracking and shifting beneath his skin. His fingers stretched into claws, dark, sharp, and menacing, while thick, black fur sprouted across his body, covering his skin in a matted, wild mane. His face elongated into a savage snout, eyes burning with an animalistic hunger, a red glow that pierced through the dim room. David watched in terror as his uncle transformed, unable to move, his legs rooted to the floor. Yet even as the horror unfolded, Finian's voice remained, guttural and rasping. Now, lad, you'll become the beast, and I will be free. The transformation completed, and Finian now stood as a towering, monstrous werewolf. His massive, hulking frame dwarfing David, black fur rippling across his back, his mouth a cavern of razor-sharp teeth, saliva dripping from his maw. He loomed over David, growling low, the sound vibrating through the walls. David, paralyzed with fear, could only stare as Finian lunged, his jaws clamping down on David's neck with a ferocity that sent white-hot pain coursing through him. The world spiraled into darkness. When David awoke, days had passed, the house silent and Finian nowhere to be found. He touched his neck where Finian had bitten him, but to his shock, there was no wound, no scar, not even an ache. Yet he could feel something changed within him, something dark and feral. Panic jolted him upright, and he sprinted outside, his instincts urging him to escape. He ran through the woods, his feet instinctively finding paths he had never taken, as if he knew every tree, every twist and turn. He reached the edge of the forest, and for a moment, relief washed over him. But as he lifted his foot to step onto the road, an excruciating pain tore through his body, as if every fibre of his being was trying to pull him back into the woods. He cried out, collapsing, rolling back into the shadows of the trees, where the pain immediately subsided. The curse, he murmured, realization dawning like a cold, iron weight on his soul. He was bound to the forest. Days turned into weeks. David moved through the forest as if he had been there his whole life, collecting wood, learning to hunt, feeling the primal pull of the land that now owned him. He began to feel oddly at home, his senses sharpening, his reflexes heightened in ways he couldn't explain. He could see deeper into the shadows, smell the faintest traces of animals in the undergrowth, and hear the softest rustle of leaves on the forest floor. Then, the night of the full moon arrived. As darkness fell, David's body tensed, his skin prickling with an indescribable sensation. His vision sharpened, his hearing intensified, and his heart began to beat with a fierce primal rhythm. He doubled over, gasping, as an unstoppable force tore through him. His limbs extended, claws ripping through his fingertips, fur spreading across his body in dark waves. He could feel his face elongating, his teeth sharpening, his humanity slipping away as the beast took over. In his mind, he saw only flashes, a blur of trees as he sprinted through the forest, his senses honing in on the faintest movement. A rabbit dashed across his path, and he pounced, driven by a savage instinct to hunt, to kill. There was no conscious thought, no restraint. He was a primal force, a creature bound to the woods, beholden only to the call of the moon. When dawn finally broke, David awoke in a hollow beneath a massive oak, his body weak and aching, his memories scattered. He understood, then, the curse that bound him. He would never leave these woods, never know the freedom of the outside world again. This place was his prison, his inheritance. There was no escape, only the relentless cycle of man becoming beast, the curse of the O'Malleys. He sat alone in the quiet of the forest, the weight of his fate settling upon him, as unyielding as the trees that surrounded him, and with a resigned sigh, he accepted his place within the shadows, knowing that he too would be part of this cursed land until he could pass the burden on to the next O'Malley. A week had passed, and David had fallen into a grim rhythm, gathering wood, hunting for food, drifting through the forest with a familiarity that was as unsettling as it was comforting. The woods were his world now, and he understood this truth with a weight that settled deep within him. But on this particular day, as he gathered wood along the edge of a clearing, he heard a voice he knew as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. "David, are you here?" David dropped the bundle of wood, his heart leaping in his chest. He ran toward the sound, weaving through the trees until he saw her, Rachel, standing in the dappled sunlight, her eyes scanning the shadows for him. Relief and disbelief flooded him, and he felt joy surge through his veins like warmth after endless cold. "Rachel," he called, running to her, pulling her into his arms with an ease that startled him, lifting her effortlessly. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears as she held him. "Where have you been, David? What happened? I've been searching for you for weeks. I was so worried." David's face softened as he looked at her, his joy dimmed only by the shadow of his newfound reality. "Oh, Rachel, I'm so happy you're here. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again." "Be careful, David," Rachel said, a hint of laughter breaking through her worry as he lowered her gently to the ground. "I have something to tell you." She took a deep breath, her hand drifting down to rest on her stomach. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." David's face lit up, his heart pounding with a strange, overwhelming mixture of joy and dread. The words left his mouth before he'd even thought them. "A son?" Rachel nodded, her eyes searching his. "We'll need to get back home, David. Back to the city, to start our family. We have so much to look forward to." But David's expression darkened, and a heavy silence hung between them. "Our home is here now, Rachel," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the curse. "We can never leave. Not until the boy is old enough." Rachel's face fell in confusion, but David's gaze had already drifted, his expression frozen, as if seeing a path he could not avoid. He knew, with the cold clarity of fate, what must be done. The curse of the O'Malleys would continue, bound to blood, bound to his son, the heir to the forest's dark inheritance. And with that, David accepted his place, the weight of the curse pressing down on him with renewed purpose, as the forest watched, silent and unyielding.
Under the O'Malley moon, blood calls to blood, a beast's curse looms where the shadows flood. Son takes the burden, father be freed, or else the forest keeps both souls in need.
Sophia was running. The cold sting of branches clawed at her arms and face as she darted deeper into the forest. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. Not with the laughter echoing behind her, sharp and cruel, cutting through the dense thicket like a blade. Freak! Weirdo! The voices taunted her, closing in. She stumbled over an exposed root and fell hard onto the damp earth. Her palms scraped against the jagged gravel, drawing blood. Panic surged through her as the footsteps grew louder. She crawled forward, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Then she saw it, the hollow, a dark, narrow gap in the base of an ancient tree. Without hesitation, she wriggled inside, curling her small body into the tight, suffocating space. She pressed her hands over her mouth, willing herself to be silent, invisible. The footsteps stopped just outside. She could hear them breathing, heavy, predatory. "Where'd she go?" one of the voices hissed. "She's here somewhere. Come out, freak!" Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, tears slipping down her cheeks as she waited for them to leave. Minutes felt like hours, the muffled sound of their taunts blending into the rustling leaves and the distant cry of a bird. Finally, the voices faded, and the forest fell silent. Sophia stayed in the hollow long after they were gone, too afraid to move, her body trembling with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Sophia woke with a start, gasping for air. Her heart thundered in her chest as her eyes darted around the small, dimly lit bedroom. It was just a dream, the same dream that had plagued her for years, dragging her back to those terrible childhood memories. She sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath her. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow on the cluttered room. Piles of unpaid bills and unopened junk mail littered the small table by the window. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust. With a heavy sigh, Sophia swung her legs over the edge of the bed and rubbed her face. She didn't need the dream to remind her of how cruel the world could be. Her waking life was proof enough. She shuffled to the kitchen, where the coffee pot was still half full from the day before. She poured herself a mug, ignoring the faintly sour taste, and carried it to the stack of mail she'd been avoiding. Flipping through the envelopes, she froze when she saw the one marked in bold letters. Finalized divorce decree. Her breath caught in her throat as she tore the envelope open, her hands trembling. The papers inside confirmed it. She was free. The last shackle tying her to her abusive ex-husband was finally severed. For a moment, she felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly swallowed by the familiar, gnawing emptiness. Freedom didn't mean happiness, not for someone like her. It just meant one less person to hurt her. She placed the papers on the table and stared at them, her eyes unfocused. Outside, the world carried on as it always did, indifferent to her existence. The sound of children playing echoed faintly through the thin walls of her apartment. Somewhere, a dog barked. Sophia let out a long, shaky breath and closed her eyes. The dream, the divorce, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle she couldn't understand. All she knew was that she was tired. Tired of being the one who ran, the one who hid. But that's all she'd ever been. Sophia trudged through the rain-soaked streets, her coat barely warding off the cold drizzle. The city bustled around her, indifferent to her presence. People brushed past, without so much as a glance. Umbrellas colliding, footsteps hurried. She felt like a ghost, floating through a world that had long since forgotten her. At the coffee shop, she joined the queue, her mind already dreading the day ahead. As she reached for her wallet, a sharply dressed woman stepped in front of her, ignoring her entirely. "Excuse me," Sophia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't even turn around. Sophia stepped back, letting it happen. It wasn't worth the fight. It never was. By the time she reached the office, her hair was damp, her shoes squelching with every step. The familiar grey walls greeted her with their oppressive blandness, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a faint, grating sound that set her teeth on edge. She walked to her desk, the small cubicle where she spent her days typing meaningless reports and answering emails no one would read. "Morning, Sophia," a colleague muttered, not bothering to look up. She managed a weak smile, but he was already gone, lost in his screen. An hour into her day, her phone rang. The stern voice of her boss, Mr. Harris, called her to his office. Mr. Harris was sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk when she entered, his fingers steepled. He didn't offer her a seat. "Sophia, come in," he said, his tone brisk. "I'll get straight to the point. We've been forced to make some cuts, and unfortunately, your position is being eliminated." Her stomach dropped. "But I've been here for years," she stammered. "I've always—" "It's not about performance," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "It's just business. You'll receive your severance details by the end of the day. HR will handle the rest." She stood there, frozen, her face burning with shame. He was already looking at his computer, dismissing her from his thoughts as easily as he had dismissed her from the company. "Thank you for your service," he added without looking up. She turned and left, her legs trembling. As she passed the break room, she heard laughter. A group of colleagues stood in a circle, their voices low but unmistakably mocking. She caught snippets, her name, her habits, her awkwardness. She kept walking, her vision blurring with tears. The walk home felt endless. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air remained. She passed the corner store where, years ago, her husband had screamed at her in public, calling her useless. She passed the playground where she used to dream of taking children of her own, dreams that had long since died. By the time she reached her apartment, she was numb. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, sliding to the floor. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, a brief, scolding message about forgetting her birthday last week. She hadn't forgotten. She just hadn't been able to afford a gift. Sophia stared at the pile of bills on her table, the final divorce decree sitting atop the stack like a tombstone. Her chest ached, and her thoughts spiraled. What was the point? She went to her laptop and typed into the search bar. How to end it all. The results were overwhelming, each one colder and more clinical than the last. Pills, ropes, bridges. She read each method with detached curiosity, but her hands trembled. She couldn't do it. She wasn't brave enough, not even for this. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the darkening sky, and then, unbidden, the memory of the dream came back. The tree, the hollow, where she'd hidden as a child. She remembered the stillness, the way time had seemed to stop as she sat there, waiting for the world to forget her. Maybe that was the answer. Not pills or bridges or anything violent. Just disappear. She would go back to the tree, climb inside, and let the forest take her. No one would look for her. No one would care. She stood, her decision made. For the first time, in what felt like forever, she felt calm. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. The tree was waiting. The car rattled down the uneven country road, headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. Sophia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The forest loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the bruised purple sky. Her chest felt tight, but it wasn't fear, not anymore. It was relief. She glanced at the empty passenger seat and exhaled a shaky breath. Memories clawed at the edges of her mind, rising unbidden with every mile. "Sophia, why do you let them treat you like that?" Her mother's sharp voice echoed in her memory, cutting through the haze. "You need to stand up for yourself, or people will walk all over you." Sophia, a teenager then, had sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched plate of food. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words never came. Her mother's disapproval, felt like a physical weight, another stone added to the burden she carried every day. She blinked, her vision blurring. The road ahead twisted, and for a moment she considered turning back. But no, there was nothing for her to go back to. Another memory surfaced, unrelenting. This one of her father, his deep, reassuring voice filling the room. "Sophia," he had said, crouching down to her level. She was just 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, her favourite book clutched in her hands. "You've got to be strong, my little star. I'll always protect you, but one day I won't be here. And when that day comes, you'll need to speak your mind. If you don't, people will walk all over you for the rest of your life." She had nodded, wide-eyed, not fully understanding the weight of his words. She hadn't known that day would come so soon. He had died suddenly, a heart attack that stole him away before she could even say goodbye. At his funeral, her mother had cried uncontrollably. Sophia had stayed silent, her small hands trembling as she clutched a single white rose. Her throat tightened, and she whispered into the empty car, "I miss you, Dad, but I'll see you soon." The memories continued to roll over her, like waves battering a crumbling shore. School bullies, their sneering faces burned into her mind. "Cry baby, Sophia." They jeered as they tore pages from her notebook. She'd never fought back. She didn't know how. Then, years later, her husband's cutting words. "You're worthless, Sophia. Do you even know how lucky you are that I put up with you?" The promotions she never got because she was too scared to ask. The friends who drifted away because she couldn't say no to their constant demands. A life of bending, breaking, and apologizing for simply existing. "If only I'd been strong enough," she muttered, her voice trembling. "They always told me to stand up for myself, but I was too scared. I just couldn't do it." Her shoulders sagged, a weight lifting as she spoke the truth aloud for the first time. Soon, it wouldn't matter anymore. She wouldn't have to face them. She wouldn't have to endure another insult, another slight, another moment of being trampled underfoot. "I won't have to live a life forced on me because I was too scared to say no," she whispered, her lips trembling. "I won't have to live at all." The forest came into view, dark and ancient, its gnarled trees reaching out like skeletal hands. She slowed the car to a stop at the edge of the woods, the engine humming softly before she turned it off. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat there for a moment, staring into the darkness. The forest was exactly as she remembered it. Time hadn't touched this place, as though it had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment. Sophia stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around her like a shroud. She didn't bother locking the doors. She wouldn't need the car again. As she walked towards the tree line, a strange calm settled over her. Each step felt lighter, as though she was shedding years of pain and fear. Her father's voice echoed in her mind one last time. "You've got to be strong, my little star." She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad. I tried." The forest swallowed her whole. The forest was eerily quiet. The crunch of Sophia's footsteps, the only sound as she moved through the dense, shadowy woods. The air was cool, heavy with the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss. As she walked, her eyes scanned the trees, searching for the one that had haunted her dreams. And then, there it was. The ancient oak stood before her, gnarled and imposing, its twisted branches reaching towards the night sky like claws. It looked exactly as she remembered it, the hollow at its base, the rough bark, even the faint patch of moss growing on one side. It was as if time had ignored this place entirely. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She approached cautiously, her fingers brushing the bark. It felt rough and cold beneath her touch, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She glanced around the clearing, but she was alone. The only movement was the gentle sway of the branches above, stirred by a faint breeze. As she examined the tree more closely, Her eyes caught on something. Strange markings etched into the bark, ones she hadn't noticed as a child. She traced them with her fingertips. A wolf's head snarled back at her, its sharp teeth carved with precision. Below it, a crescent moon cradled a star with 5 points, the edges jagged and unnatural. Sophia frowned, her brow furrowing. She didn't remember these markings. Were they always here? She shrugged it off. What did it matter? She hadn't come to solve mysteries. She crouched down, peering into the hollow. It looked smaller than she remembered, but she didn't hesitate. She slipped inside, her body protesting as she squeezed through the narrow opening. The bark scraped her arms and legs, but she managed to wedge herself into the cramped space. Sitting there, knees pulled to her chest, Sophia closed her eyes. The familiar darkness enveloped her, and for a moment she felt safe, but the silence didn't last. Voices began to rise around her, faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. "You're nothing, Sophia." Her ex-husband's voice, sharp and venomous, rang in her ears. "She's always been a crybaby," came another voice, her school bullies laughing cruelly. "You'll never amount to anything." Her mother's disapproving tone cut through her like a knife. One after another, they came, overlapping and growing louder until it felt like they were right outside the hollow. She covered her ears, trying to shut them out, but the voices pushed through, relentless and unyielding. She shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, and her hand brushed against something sharp. A sudden, searing pain shot through her palm. She pulled her hand back, staring at the wound. Blood welled up, dripping down her wrist. But it wasn't just a cut. The shape was distinct, a perfect star, with 5 jagged points. It glistened in the faint light, as though the blood itself was alive. The voices stopped. Silence fell over the forest, heavy and suffocating. Sophia felt faint, her head spinning as she stared at her bleeding hand. "This is it," she thought. "They've won. I'll just give up." Her vision blurred, and she slumped forward, her body growing heavy. She was ready to let go, to fade into nothingness. But then she froze. Something stirred deep within her, a spark igniting in her chest. She looked up, out of the hollow, and her vision cleared. Her breath quickened as a new thought took hold, one that burned brighter and hotter with each passing second. No. Her hands curled into fists, the blood from her palms smearing against the bark. How dare they? She pushed herself upright, her head pounding with a newfound clarity. What are they but weak, feeble nobodies? She wouldn't give them this victory. She wouldn't let them win. Not now. Not ever. Sophia climbed out of the tree, her movements fluid and purposeful. She stood tall, the weight of years of pain and humiliation falling away like a discarded cloak. She glanced at her hands. The wound on her palm had stopped bleeding, but the star remained, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her nails had lengthened, her fingers tipped with sharp claws. Sophia stepped back from the tree and caught her reflection in a puddle on the forest floor. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her once pale and tired face was now sharp and angular, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. Her lips curled into a wicked smile. She no longer looked like the weak, feeble woman who had entered the woods. She looked strong, powerful, evil. The forest seemed to bow before her, the shadows deepening as if to welcome her into their embrace. Sophia turned, her voice low and dangerous, as she whispered to the night, "They'll regret every moment they underestimated me." She walked away from the tree, her steps deliberate and filled with purpose. The woods trembled in her wake. Sophia sat in the darkness of her living room, her body still and her eyes locked on the shadowed corner across the room. In the dim light, a figure loomed, a monstrous reflection of herself, half wolf, half human. It stood tall and powerful, its eyes glowing with an eerie, predatory light. Its fur bristled like black flames, and its claws twitched with barely restrained hunger. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She simply stared, transfixed. This is me, she thought. Her true self. The part of her that had been caged and silenced her entire life. The beast looked back at her, its lips curling into a feral grin, as if it knew the chains that had bound it were gone. Sophia didn't sleep that night. She didn't need to. The fire within her burned too brightly. The next morning, she drove with purpose. Her destination, her ex-husband's house. When she knocked, the door opened to reveal a woman, slim, polished, and dripping with disdain. "Oh, it's you," the woman said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "I thought everything was signed. What do you want now?" She turned and called out, "David, your ex-wife's here." David appeared a moment later, his expression twisting into a sneer. "What the hell do you want, Sophia?" Sophia didn't answer. She pushed forward with startling force, sending him sprawling onto the floor. "Have you totally gone crazy, Sophia?" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. The woman stepped beside him, her phone already in hand. "We're calling the police," she snapped. But then the room shifted. Behind them, in the corner, something stirred. The shadows thickened, coalescing into the familiar form of the beast. It towered over the couple, its eyes blazing, its claws flexing. Sophia stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She felt no fear, only exhilaration. "This is what I've always wanted," she thought. The beast lunged. Claws slashed through flesh. Teeth tore into bone. The woman's screams were cut short as the creature ripped her apart. David's protests turned into wet gurgles as the beast sank its fangs into his throat, blood spraying across the pristine walls. Sophia watched it all, her heart pounding with glee. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. The room was painted red, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood, and she revelled in every second. She left the house without a word, her footsteps light, her heart thrumming with dark satisfaction. Her next destination was her old workplace. The drive was short, but her mind raced with anticipation. She parked and walked through the front doors with a confidence that felt entirely foreign and entirely right. The whispers began immediately. "What's she doing here?" "Isn't that the loser they fired?" "She looks different." Sophia ignored them all, her gaze fixed on the hallway ahead. She reached the boss's office and pushed the door open without knocking. Her former boss, Mr. Harris, glanced up from his desk, startled. "Sophia, what are you doing here? Look, if you're here to beg for your job back, the answer's no." She stepped closer, a smile curling on her lips. "I don't want my job," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I want you." Harris frowned, his confusion quickly turning to unease. Before he could respond, the air behind him shifted. The shadows seemed to ripple, and then the beast appeared, its massive form filling the room. "What the—" Harris started, but his words turned into a scream as the creature grabbed him, its claws sinking deep into his flesh. Sophia watched as the beast tore into him, its growls reverberating through the room. Blood splattered across the desk and walls as Harris's struggles grew weaker, until finally he went limp. The beast wasn't done. It smashed through the office door and into the main area, where the whispers and sneers turned to panicked screams. One by one, the employees fell, their bodies torn apart by the creature's fury. There was no escape. Sophia walked through the chaos untouched. She watched as her darkest thoughts, the ones she had buried for so long, played out before her. The beast was her. It was the anger, the pain, the humiliation she had endured for decades, unleashed without restraint. In the days that followed, Sophia continued her reign of vengeance. She visited the bullies who had tormented her as a child, the so-called friends who had used her, the teachers who had ignored her cries for help. Each time, The beast appeared, emerging from the shadows to exact the punishment Sophia had always dreamed of but had never dared to carry out. She stood by, watching with a wicked smile as the beast clawed, bit, and tore through them all. She felt no guilt, no regret, only power. By the time she returned home each night, the beast was gone, but its presence lingered in the edges of her mind, a constant reminder of her transformation. This was her life now, no longer the weak, feeble woman who cowered in fear. She was something else entirely, something stronger, darker, unstoppable, and for the first time, Sophia felt alive. Sophia drove through the night, the forest looming ahead, its shadowy depths pulling her like a magnet. Her grip on the wheel was tight, her breaths shallow. She could feel the walls closing in. The police would come soon, there was no doubt about that. Her face, her name, her actions would be plastered everywhere. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. But the tree had always been her refuge. It had protected her before. It would protect her again. The car skidded to a halt at the forest's edge. Sophia grabbed her bag and stumbled into the woods, her heart pounding. The path to the tree seemed clearer now, as if the forest itself was guiding her. When she reached it, the ancient oak stood as imposing as ever, its hollow gaping like a dark, hungry mouth. Without hesitation, she climbed inside, squeezing through the narrow opening. But as her feet found the bottom, something shifted. The ground beneath her gave way, and she plunged into darkness. She landed hard on cold stone, the air knocked from her lungs. Dazed, she looked around. The space was vast, far larger than the hollow above had ever suggested. The walls glistened with strange markings, glowing faintly in the hues of green and silver. A heavy, oppressive energy filled the air, pressing down on her chest. Sophia tried to climb back up, but the walls of the hollow were smooth, impossibly steep. She froze when she heard it, a voice deep and gravelly, reverberating through the chamber like the growl of a distant storm. "Sophia!" She spun around, her heart leaping to her throat. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around her like a predator, circling its prey. "There is no longer anything for you out there. You have set me free." Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air seemed to vibrate as the voice spoke again, louder this time. "I have been bound here for centuries, sealed by those who feared my power. But long ago, I connected with you. I saw your pain, your despair. I knew you would return. I knew you would free me." Sophia shook her head, stepping back. "I don't understand. How did I free you?" The voice rumbled with dark amusement. "Your blood, Sophia. The blood of the Pentagon. The seal that bound me required the touch of a human marked by despair and rage. When you cut your hand on the tree, the seal was broken." Her thoughts raced. The strange wound on her palm, the voices that had haunted her, the figure that had emerged from the shadows to exact her revenge. It had all led to this. "But that was me," Sophia said, her voice rising. "I killed those people." "No," the voice replied, low and mocking. "You saw me do what you could not. I used your hatred, your pain, to fuel my strength. Those deaths were necessary, Sophia. They were sacrifices to restore my power, so that I may step into the light of your world." Sophia's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground. "So, I'm just still me?" The voice softened, almost gentle now. "No, Sophia, you are so much more. You have carried my essence, my power, but you remain bound by the rules of your world. You are wanted for those deaths, and they will hunt you. You cannot escape their judgment." The chamber grew colder, the oppressive energy thickening as the voice delivered its ultimatum. "You have two choices, Sophia. You can stay here, in this place. Soon it will become your prison, as it was mine, until another comes to free you, as you have freed me." The voice paused, and the weight of its words hung in the air. "Or if you've truly had enough for helping me walk in your world, I can end you now. No pain, no suffering, just peace. Make your choice, Sophia." Oh. Sophia sat motionless, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a mountain. Her mind raced, replaying every moment that had brought her to this place. The pain, the humiliation, the anger, the fleeting moments of power, the joy of vengeance. And now, the crushing realization that none of it had truly been hers. Her gaze drifted to her hands, the faint glow of the pentagon scar on her palm. She clenched her fists, her breath shallow and uneven. The chamber grew silent, the voice waiting patiently for her answer. Sophia closed her eyes. The silent howl. Emily sat at her cubicle, her headset clamped tightly over her ears, the cord twisting around her wrist like a tether to a prison. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead hummed, adding a low, insidious drone to the constant stream of complaints that flowed through her earpiece. The office was a sea of grey. Grey walls, grey desks, grey faces staring blankly at computer screens. It was as if the colour had been drained from everything, leaving only a dull, lifeless monotone. "Can you hear me?" barked the voice of yet another irate customer. "I've been waiting on hold for over an hour." Emily closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, fighting the urge to snap back. "Yes, I can hear you, ma'am," she replied, her voice calm and steady, though every muscle in her body was tense. "I apologize for the wait. How can I assist you today?" The woman on the other end launched into a tirade about a faulty delivery, the words blurring into a familiar rhythm of anger and frustration. Emily had heard it all before. The threats, the insults, the demands for refunds or managers. It was a never-ending cycle. Like the hamster wheel she felt trapped on, spinning endlessly with no escape. She glanced at the clock on her screen. 4:37 p.m. Just 23 more minutes until the end of her shift. Though she knew it wouldn't be over. Not really. Her manager, Claire, would inevitably find some reason to keep her there. Extra paperwork, some new directive from corporate, another set of reports due by morning. Claire's idea of leadership was a sharp word and an endless list of tasks, piling up like the unpaid bills on Emily's kitchen table. "Emily." Claire's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Emily flinched, tearing the headset away from her ear. Claire stood by her desk, arms crossed, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Yes," Emily said, trying to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "Why is this customer still on the line? You need to be more efficient. Handle the calls faster, or we'll be having another performance review," Claire snapped. Emily nodded, swallowing her frustration. "Yes, Claire, I'm doing my best." Claire scoffed, turning away. "Your best isn't good enough, Emily. You need to step it up if you want to keep this job." The words cut deep, although while they were nothing new. Emily had been with the company for over 2 years, and not once had she received a word of encouragement or praise. Every day was the same grinding routine. Wake up at 6 a.m. in her cramped flat in Acton, catch the crowded bus to the office, spend 8 hours taking abuse from strangers, then return home to care for her ailing mother, who depended on her for everything. There was no time for dreams, no space for aspirations, only the suffocating reality of survival. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a reminder of her overdraft. Her rent was due in a week, and she didn't have enough in her account to cover it. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of everything crushing her shoulders. The call finally ended, the customer's voice cutting off mid-rant. Emily took a deep breath, glancing around the room. Her co-workers were equally worn down, hunched over their desks like broken dolls. She noticed James, the lecherous manager from the adjacent team, leering at her from across the room. He made a show of stretching, his eyes never leaving her, and she felt a familiar surge of disgust. "Hey, Em," he called, grinning. "When are you going to come have a drink with me? You know you want to." Emily forced a polite smile, the rage simmering just beneath her skin. "No thanks, James. I'm busy." "Oh, come on," he persisted, his voice oily. "Don't be like that. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be so uptight." She wanted to scream, to shout, to tell him exactly where to shove his leering grin, but she bit her tongue. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Not now. Not with her mother depending on her. Not with the bills stacking up like a noose around her neck. The clock ticked to 5 p.m. and Claire approached her desk again, a folder in hand. "Before you go, I need you to finish these reports," she said without looking at Emily. "They're due first thing tomorrow." Emily stared at the stack of papers, her shoulders slumping. "I was planning to—" "Do I look like I care about your plans?" Claire snapped. "Just get it done." Emily nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, Claire." Claire turned and walked away, and Emily felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She blinked them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not now. By the time she finally left the office, it was nearly 7 p.m. The sky was a deep, inky black, the air cool and crisp. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, the bite of the evening wind cutting through her thin clothing. Her feet felt heavy as she walked, each step a struggle against the weight pressing down on her chest. She decided to take a detour through the park on her way home, hoping the fresh air might help clear her head. The park was quiet, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. The path wound through the darkened greenery, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She felt a strange pull, an urge to go deeper into the park, away from the city, away from everything. The full moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the branches, casting an eerie glow over the ground. She kept walking, her breath visible in the cold night air, her mind numb from the day's onslaught. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl. Her heart leapt into her throat, her body freezing in place. She saw a figure up ahead, hunched over, wrestling with something on the ground. As she drew closer, she realized it was a man, homeless, she guessed by his tattered clothing, being attacked by some dark, shadowy creature. Without thinking, Emily rushed forward, grabbing a fallen branch from the ground. She swung it wildly, shouting, trying to scare the creature away. It turned to face her, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow in the darkness. It snarled, its mouth filled with sharp, glistening teeth, and lunged at her with a speed that took her breath away. She felt its teeth sink into her arm, the pain searing through her skin like fire. She screamed and swung the branch again, harder this time, connecting with the creature's side. It yelped and released her, darting back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Emily stumbled backward, clutching her arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The homeless man lay on the ground, unconscious, but breathing. She looked down at her arm, blood pouring from the bite, her skin already starting to burn, a fever spreading through her veins like poison. She felt dizzy, her vision blurring. She staggered back, her body trembling, a strange sensation washing over her, a hunger, deep and primal, clawing at her insides. And somewhere, deep in the distance, she heard a howl. The night closed in around her, and Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Emily trudged up the dimly lit stairwell of her building, each step echoing in the hollow concrete walls. She reached the top floor, out of breath, and feeling the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. Her block of flats, a decaying monolith in the heart of Acton, was a place no one dared walk alone at night. The paint on the walls was peeling. The lift had been broken for months, and the few flickering lights cast long, menacing shadows across the corridor. She reached her door, fumbling for her keys with a shaky hand. The bite on her arm throbbed, sending sharp waves of pain through her body. She could feel a fever burning under her skin, a deep, unsettling heat that seemed to be spreading. Finally, she found the key, shoved it into the lock, and pushed the door open, stepping into her small, cramped flat. "Mum, I'm home," she called out, her voice weaker than she intended. The sound of the television filled the room, a low, droning noise playing to no one in particular. Her mother, Esther, sat in her worn armchair by the window, her thin frame almost lost in its sagging cushions. She was staring out, her eyes distant, lost in the fog of age and illness. Emily knew her mother barely noticed the passing days, each one blurring into the next in a haze of pain and medication. Emily crossed the room and knelt beside her mother, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling, Mum?" Esther turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing on Emily with effort. "The same, love. Just tired." Her voice was frail, a whisper that seemed to fade as soon as it left her lips. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She checked the medication on the side table, making sure everything was in order, then moved to the small kitchen. The stack of bills on the counter caught her eye. Rent overdue, electricity warning, final notice for the water bill. It felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of it all were pressing down on her, suffocating her. She stared at the numbers, her vision blurring. What was the point? Day after day, she slogged through the grind, just to keep the lights on and the roof over their heads. There was no escape, no light at the end of the tunnel, just the endless drudgery of work and worry. She was nothing more than a clockwork worker, wound up every morning and set loose in the machine of her life. The bite on her arm pulsed, a hot, searing pain that seemed to radiate through her veins. She pulled up her sleeve and looked at it, a raw, angry wound with red streaks spreading outwards. She felt lightheaded, a wave of nausea rolling through her. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. There was a knock at the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew who it would be before she even opened it. She unlocked the door and found herself face to face with Marcus, her neighbor from 2 floors down. He was leaning casually against the frame, his grin too wide, his eyes too eager. He was always there, always watching her. He'd been asking her out for months, no matter how many times she said no. "Hey, Emily," he drawled, his eyes scanning her up and down. "Fancy going out tonight? We could grab a drink, maybe something more." Emily felt a wave of revulsion wash over her. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice firm but shaky. "I've told you I'm not interested." His smile faltered, turning into a sneer. "Oh, come on, Em. Don't be like that. I know you're lonely up here all by yourself. Just give it a chance." Her patience snapped. The pain in her arm seemed to surge, a sudden jolt of heat running up her spine. "I said no!" she yelled, her voice louder than she intended, echoing through the corridor. Marcus's face twisted with anger. "You don't have to be a bitch about it," he spat. "I'm just trying to be nice." Something inside Emily shifted. Her skin prickled, her muscles tightened. She felt a strength she didn't recognize, a raw, primal anger rising up in her chest. She took a step forward, and Marcus stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. For a brief moment, she saw fear flash in his eyes. "Get out," she growled, her voice low and guttural. "Now." Marcus hesitated, then turned and hurried down the stairs, muttering curses under his breath. Emily slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps, Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was something else. Something fierce and powerful coursing through her veins. The adrenaline faded, leaving her weak, her legs trembling. She staggered to her small bed in the corner of the room and collapsed onto it, her arm burning with pain. Her eyes felt heavy, her body sinking into the mattress as if being swallowed by it. She drifted into sleep, her mind tumbling into darkness. In her dreams, she was running through a thick, shadowy forest. The trees blurred past her, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. She was fast, her feet pounding the earth, her breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. But she wasn't afraid. No, she felt free, liberated, as if the weight of her life was lifting with each step. She ran faster, her limbs moving with an ease she had never known. She felt the wind in her hair, the cool air on her skin. She was leaving everything behind. The bills, the job, the small, suffocating flat. She could feel her fears and inhibitions falling away, one by one, stripped from her like layers of dead skin. But then the dream shifted. She saw flashes of her past, her teenage years on the estate, the cold, dark alley where she had been attacked. She saw the faces of her attackers, their mocking grins, their hands grabbing at her. She remembered the humiliation, the fear, the way they had broken her down piece by piece. Her ex-boyfriend, sneering, telling her she was worthless, that no one would ever want her. The abuse, the manipulation, the slow, insidious erosion of her self-worth. But even as she saw their faces, heard their taunts, she felt something else. She was running faster now, her body powerful, unstoppable. She felt a fierce joy, a defiance, and realized she wasn't running on 2 legs but 4. Her vision sharpened, her senses alive with the smell of the forest, the sound of her heart pounding in her chest. She felt wild, untamed, a creature of the night. And then she woke. Emily gasped, sitting up in bed, her heart racing. The room was still dark, the first grey light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She glanced at her arm, expecting to see the angry wound, but it was gone. The skin was smooth, unblemished, not even a scar. She stared at it, her mind spinning. How was it possible? She felt different, stronger. She pushed herself out of bed, crossing the room to check on her mother. Esther was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Emily closed the door quietly, leaning against it for a moment, feeling the beat of her heart in her chest. Something had changed, something deep and profound. She felt a strange sense of anticipation, a thrill she couldn't quite understand. She took a deep breath, and with a final glance back at her mother, she stepped out into the new day. The morning air was cold and biting as Emily walked to the bus stop, her breath visible in the early light. She felt different today, sharper, more alert. The dull ache of exhaustion that had clung to her like a shroud seemed lighter, less oppressive. Her senses felt heightened. She noticed everything around her in vivid detail. The flicker of a street lamp, the faint scent of damp concrete, the distant hum of traffic. The bus arrived, rattling to a halt with a groan, and Emily climbed aboard, moving quickly to find a seat. The bus was already crowded, the familiar mix of tired commuters and bleary-eyed school kids, packed together like sardines. She squeezed past a group of men lounging in the back, their eyes following her as she passed. One of them, a tall man with a crooked grin, leaned forward. "Hey, beautiful," he slurred, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why don't you come sit here, next to me?" The other men laughed, their eyes gleaming with amusement. Emily felt a flicker of anger, a heat rising in her chest. She stopped and turned, locking eyes with the man. Her gaze was cold, steady, unwavering. The man's grin faltered for a moment, as if something in her eyes had caught him off guard. "I don't have time for your games," Emily said, her voice low and firm. "So why don't you just shut up and let everyone here have a peaceful ride?" The man blinked, his smile fading. The others fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats. There was something in her tone, in the way she held herself, that made them hesitate. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The tall man opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He looked away, suddenly interested in the floor, and Emily turned and found a seat near the front. She felt a strange rush of satisfaction as she sat down. She didn't know what had come over her, but it felt good. It felt powerful. The bus rolled through the streets of London, the buildings passing by in a blur. Soon they arrived at her stop, and Emily stepped off, feeling a cool breeze against her face. She made her way to the office, her footsteps confident, purposeful. Inside, the same grey monotony greeted her, the same droning lights, the same murmurs of conversation, the same sense of suffocating sameness. But today, Emily felt different. She felt alive. She sat down at her cubicle, put on her headset, and began to take her first calls of the day. The initial ones went smoothly, the customers polite and straightforward, but then her screen flashed, and she saw the name of a notorious caller, a woman who had terrorized the team with her rants and unreasonable demands for weeks. Emily took a deep breath and answered, "This is Emily. How can I help you today?" The woman on the other end didn't waste a second. "About time. Do you people have any idea how long I've been waiting? My bill is completely wrong again, and I demand you fix it right now." Emily held the phone away from her ear for a moment, the woman's shrill voice piercing through the headset. She'd dealt with customers like this 100 times before, always calm, always professional. But today, something inside her snapped. "Ma'am," she said, interrupting the tirade, "if you'd just pay your bill on time, you wouldn't have these problems. It's that easy." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Emily could almost hear the woman's jaw drop. Before the customer could recover, Emily hung up, feeling a small, rebellious smile curl on her lips. A moment later, Claire was at her desk, her face flushed with anger. "Emily, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "We don't speak to customers like that. You're here to take their abuse, not dish it out." Emily turned to face her manager, her eyes cold and sharp. "You know what, Claire?" she cut in, her voice firm. "Maybe if you treated us like human beings and not like punching bags, we wouldn't be losing customers left and right. And just because your husband left, you doesn't mean you can treat us like children." Claire's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The entire office fell silent, every head turning toward them. Claire's hand trembled, and she looked as if she might collapse. How dare you?" Claire stammered, but Emily wasn't finished. "Oh, I dare," Emily continued, a newfound strength in her voice. "And while I'm at it, take your job and shove it somewhere the sun won't find it. I'm done." Without waiting for a response, Emily stood up, grabbed her coat, and began walking toward the door. Her co-workers watched in stunned silence, their mouths agape. As she passed James, he gave her a sly grin. "Wow, Em," he chuckled. "You sure stuck it to her. Never thought you had it in you." Emily stopped and turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "And you," she said sharply, "why don't you stop creeping around like a sad old dog and get a life, James? Your little games don't scare anyone. They just make you pathetic." James blinked, his smile vanishing, leaving him speechless. Emily didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the office, pushing through the glass doors and stepping out into the cold morning air. She felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders as she walked away, leaving the office behind her. The thrill of standing up for herself coursed through her veins like a shot of adrenaline. She felt free for the first time in years. When she reached home, she shut the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep, calming breath. She listened to the silence, feeling the thump of her heart in her chest. For now, she was safe. For now, the world outside could wait. Emily moved around her small flat, her hands busy with chores, her mind numb from the events of the day. She had helped her mother as best as she could, ensuring she was comfortable, had taken her medication, and had something to eat. The evening felt heavy. The shadows in their cramped home seemed longer, darker. Every movement felt labored, like she was moving through water. She was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally drained. Finally, she turned in for the night, collapsing onto a narrow bed. The bite on her arm no longer hurt, but it pulsed with a strange energy, as if something beneath the surface was trying to escape. Her body ached, with a weariness that ran deep into her bones. She needed sleep. She needed escape. The moment her eyes closed, she was back in the dark. She was running again, not on 2 legs, but on 4. The ground blurred beneath her, each stride long and powerful. She felt the wind rush through her fur, smelled the cold earth and wet grass. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat, rhythmic and fierce. She wasn't herself. She was something else, something wild and untamed. Ahead, she saw 2 men loitering by a street corner. Their shapes were familiar, blurred by the shadows, but their laughter was sharp and grating. As she drew closer, she recognized one of them, the man who had attacked her years ago, the man who had denied everything when she reported him, who walked free while she carried the scars. A deep, primal growl rumbled from her throat, and without thinking, she leapt toward him. Her vision was a blur of fury and motion, her teeth sinking into flesh, her claws raking across skin. She felt their blood warm and slick on her tongue, heard their cries of pain and terror cutting through the night like a blade. She tore at them, bit down with a ferocity she never knew she possessed, their screams fading into gurgles, and then silence. She left them there, broken and bleeding, and began to run again. Her paws pounded the pavement, the world around her a smear of darkness. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was moving, driven by an instinct she couldn't control. She reached a house, an old familiar house. Her heart clenched with recognition. It was the house of an old friend. No, not a friend anymore. The woman who had betrayed her, who had slept with her ex-boyfriend, shattering the last bit of trust Emily had in her. She scratched at the door, a guttural growl rising from deep within her chest. The door opened, and there she was, her former friend, her face twisting into a scream of horror. Emily lunged forward, her body propelled by a savage rage. She felt her teeth pierce the woman's flesh, heard her bones crack under her powerful jaws. Her screams filled the air, but Emily felt no pity, no remorse, only a burning satisfaction, a release. She was running again, her senses alive with the night. She knew where she was headed, even before she saw it. The house of her old schoolteacher, the man who had tormented her, belittled her, told her she would amount to nothing. He had made her school life a living hell, and now, in his old age, he thought he was safe. Emily saw the light on upstairs, a silhouette moving behind the curtains. Her muscles coiled, and she leapt, smashing through the window with a crash that shattered the night. She saw him, the old man, his eyes wide with terror, and she lunged. Her claws tore through the air, her teeth snapped down. His cries were muffled as she dragged him to the floor, feeling his frail body struggle beneath her weight. She tore into him with a fierce, primal joy until there was nothing left but silence. And then another image. A man she barely remembered, a face from long ago who had once made her feel small and worthless. She saw herself tearing through the darkness, hunting him, his fear like a scent in the air. She found him, and without hesitation, she attacked, biting, clawing, the fury consuming her entirely. The blood, the screams, the feeling of power and vengeance flowed through her like a river. She was alive. She was free. She was... Emily woke with a gasp, her body jerking upright in bed. Her heart was racing, her skin damp with sweat. She felt strong, stronger than she had ever felt before. Her muscles felt taut and alive, humming with a strange energy. She breathed deeply, feeling her senses come alive with clarity. She felt powerful, confident, almost invincible. But then she saw the TV. The morning news was on, the anchor's voice urgent, a tone of disbelief in her words. Emily blinked, her eyes focusing on the screen. In a shocking turn of events, 5 people were found dead last night, victims of what police are describing as a savage animal attack. The victims, found in different parts of the city, appear to have been mauled by some kind of large predator. Witnesses reported hearing strange growls and screams in the night, but authorities are still searching for answers. The city remains on high alert. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. 5 people. 5 people she had dreamed of, attacked, torn apart in her sleep. Could it be possible? Could the dreams be real? Her hands trembled as she reached for the remote, turning the volume down. Her eyes darted to the bite on her arm, now just a faint scar, and back to the screen. She felt a cold, creeping dread settle in her stomach. What had she done? Was she becoming, that thing? She backed away from the television, her back pressing against the wall. She felt the walls closing in, her breath quickening. Was she losing her mind? Was this some twisted nightmare she couldn't wake from? Emily locked herself in her room, her heart racing, her hands clammy. She didn't know what was real anymore, what was a dream, and what was reality. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening to her, it wasn't over, and she wasn't sure if she was terrified or exhilarated. She slid down to the floor, her back against the door, and wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling. She had never felt so powerful and so afraid. Emily sat on the floor of her small room, her back pressed against the cold, wooden door, her heart still racing. Her mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and fears, swirling faster with every breath. She stared at the TV screen, the news anchor's voice barely registering in her ears. 5 people, dead in one night, all mauled by some unknown beast. Could it be her? She shut her eyes tightly, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the dream that felt so real. But just then, she heard her mother's voice from the other room. "Emily, come here." The voice was different, unusually strong. It was clear and commanding, unlike the frail, soft tone her mother usually had. Emily hesitated for a moment, then slowly rose to her feet and walked into the living room. Her mother sat upright in her armchair, eyes sharper, more alert than Emily had seen in years. "Come, sit by me," her mother said, her voice almost youthful, filled with an energy Emily had never known. Emily obeyed, sitting on the small stool by her mother's side, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Listen to me, child," her mother began, her voice low and steady, almost like a chant. "I have a story to tell you, one I heard many years ago from my own mother, who heard it from hers, passed down through generations." Emily leaned in closer, her heart beating faster. "There is a legend in our family," her mother continued, "a story about the wolf. The wolf is said to appear to those in desperate need, those who are lost, those who have reached the end of their strength. It is a guide, a force that helps people turn their lives around, to find a new path, a new purpose." Emily's eyes widened. She felt a chill run down her spine. "Your great-great-grandfather," her mother went on. "He was a man who had lost everything. His family, his home, his hope. He was desperate, alone, ready to give up. And then he became the wolf. It was said he roamed the night, a creature of both shadow and strength, until his life had meaning again, until he was able to rebuild, to find joy once more. The wolf stayed with him until he no longer needed it." Her mother's eyes seemed to look right through her, as if seeing something far away, something only she could perceive. "Emily," she said softly, "maybe the wolf has come to you now, to help you, to guide you. Perhaps you have been chosen, just like he was." Emily stared at her mother, her heart racing. "But what if it's true? What if I've hurt people?" Her mother's face softened, her voice suddenly gentler, more like her usual self. "Emily, what are you talking about? Why aren't you at work? You should be working." Emily blinked, her mother's tone changing so suddenly, as if waking from a trance. The clarity in her mother's eyes faded back into the familiar haze. Emily realized that her mother might not even remember what she had just said, but the words stayed with Emily, a seed planted deep in her mind. That night, Emily tried to stay awake, her eyes wide open, her mind racing with thoughts of wolves and strange dreams, but the fatigue was too much. It pressed down on her, heavy and irresistible. Her eyelids grew heavier with each passing moment, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't fight it any longer. Sleep claimed her. Once again, she was in the darkness, running. But this time, it was different. She wasn't running towards something or away. She was simply moving, feeling the night air in her fur, the ground beneath her paws. She saw a young man ahead, standing alone on a bridge, looking down into the cold, dark water below. He turned to see her, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling. Emily felt a surge of something primal, an urge she couldn't control. She leapt toward him, and in an instant, her teeth sank into his flesh. She bit down, tasting blood, and then she woke up. Emily jolted upright in her bed, gasping for breath. Her skin was slick with sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at her arm, where the bite had been. It was gone, and not a scar, not a mark, nothing. She touched the spot, feeling her smooth, unblemished skin. The pain, the burning sensation, it had vanished. She felt different, strong, confident. The phone rang suddenly, startling her. She reached for it, her hand still trembling. "Hello?" she answered, her voice uncertain. "Emily," a voice on the other end said. "This is David, the director from your old job. I heard what happened yesterday, how you stood up to Claire, and I have to say, we need someone like you." Emily blinked, trying to process his words. "Like me?" "Yes," David continued. "Someone with confidence, strength, who won't be pushed around. We're looking for a new manager, someone to help build the team back up, give it direction. The job comes with a significant pay raise, a company car, pension, and full medical care for you and your family. What do you say?" Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. This was what she had always wanted: recognition, respect, a chance to make a difference. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. I'll think about it," she managed to say, her mind spinning. She hung up and turned to the TV, still on in the corner of the room. Her eyes widened as she saw the news flash across the screen. Another killing. The anchor spoke in an urgent tone. "A creature seen fleeing from the scene of the attack. Authorities are still searching for clues, but witnesses report seeing something large and shadowy near the bridge." Emily stared at the screen, the pieces falling into place. The man in her dream, the one she had bitten, he was the one they were talking about. She realized with a sudden, deep certainty that the wolf had passed from her to him. Somehow, she had given him the strength he needed, just as she had received it from another, and he had taken a life that had tormented him. It wasn't just a curse, it was a cycle, a gift for those who needed it most. She had been chosen when she needed it, and now she had chosen another. She turned to her mother, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "Everything is going to be okay now, Mum," she whispered, her voice steady, her heart calm. "The wolf is with us." Her mother nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt truly at peace. She had faced her fears, stood up for herself, and found a strength she never knew she had. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready. The end.